Okay, today we go into Genesis 21. And what is interesting, Isaac is going to be born. As we look at Isaac, the last three or four chapters, really since chapter 12, we have been building to this moment. We've been talking about the seed of Abraham all throughout Genesis, the seed of the woman, the seed of Abraham. And here we see the delivery of this promise, and it's rather anticlimactic as we go in. So we pick up in Genesis 21, and the Lord visited Sarah as he had said he would. And I meant to highlight that. It says 3 times in these first 2 verses, God did what he said he would. And thus I believe, because it says it 3 times right at the beginning, the focus here is not that Sarah gave birth. She was, 90 years old? That's not the issue. God said, the issue is God said it and he did it. And God always does what he says.
But if you'll remember, God didn't fulfill that promise until Sarah and Abraham dealt with the sin in their lives.
Well, sure. God using us is never the problem. Making ourselves usable is always our issue.
They run around and told everybody that Sarah was his sister. When they quit doing that, they had the son.
Well, and there's a lot of irony in this story. The Hebrews love the ironic twist. But the first thing, when God made his promise that he was going to deliver the land in Abraham, and that's one of the sub-themes here, Abraham's still not in the land. The land hadn't been delivered yet. He's still a wanderer, sojourner. But back in chapter 12, God promised the land to Abraham. And the first thing he did was he left the land, went to Egypt, and he gave his wife into Pharaoh's harem. He sinned and jeopardized God's promises, made himself unusable. There's one sure way to guarantee that you will not impregnate your wife, and that is to put them in another man's harem. About all you can do. And so the focus, as we've always said, we say it almost every week, this Bible is about who God is, and we are to learn from the mistakes and successes of the characters in here. God had said, and the Lord visited Sarah, let's count them, 1 time, as he had said he would. And the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken, as he had said that he would do. That's 2. What did he say? Well, you got to go back to Genesis 18 when the 3 men came and Sarah was in her tent listening, just giggling. And he said, I will certainly return to you according to the time of life. Some translations translate that in about a year. But it literally said, this is more of a literal translation, in that time of life. And behold, Sarah your wife shall have a son. Sarah was listening in the tent door, which was behind him, out of his sight. Verse 2 of chapter 21 says, for Sarah conceived. God had said it, God had said it. For Sarah had conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the set time of which God had spoken to him. So there's 3 times. It says, this is what God said would happen. Focuses on God. Abraham did everything he could, and he made every excuse, and they have turned to the law code of the land in order to fix their problems. They've looked to the government, you might say, to fix their problems, and none of it worked. As a matter of fact, they got in deeper and deeper trouble each time, trying to do things. But what does the Bible want us to know about God? He said he would do this. Now, we've been waiting 25 years. Let's have mercy a little bit. We can read the Bible. We can read from Genesis 12 to Genesis 21. How long does it take us? 15 or 20 minutes? Maybe 25 minutes? Well, it took Abraham 25 years to get to this point. So it's easy for us to judge him, especially knowing that he's going to get what is promised. But the Bible is not even worried about the 25 years. It wants us to know when God makes a promise, God delivers his promise. What we struggle with is trying to accept God's will versus getting mad at God when he doesn't deliver our will. That's our struggle. We want a certain set of things. We want certain outcomes, and we have to, the only way that we get our prayer answered 100% time, anybody know that? It's right there in Jesus' prayer. Thy will be done. And so our whole thing is not to get God through prayer to do what we want him to do. You know what that's called? That's called divination. That's what all these pagan priests did. They believed if they knew the God's name through an incantation, they could say, the storm god's real name. We'll say Baal. Baal was the Canaanite. Baal is the Canaanite word meaning Lord. And he was the thunder, the lightning god, the war god that made it rain in the spring. And they figured, well, he has a real name, a secret name. His secret name was Steve. I know it, but they didn't know it. And if they would trip across the name Steve while they were making an incantation, they could force Baal to make it rain. That's what divination is, where you're trying to force the divine to do your will. And that's what we try to do when we pray sometimes. If we're not careful, we're trying to get God through a will, a prayerful will, to shape reality the way we want it to fall. And that's the backwards. That's the upside down thing that sin does. How do we get our prayer answer? To pray for God to do his will. And to align our nervous system, to align our life, so that we are contributing to God's plan versus trying to force God to bend reality to meet our desires. And so these verses are saying it didn't happen because Abraham wanted it to happen. It didn't happen when Abraham wanted it to happen. Abraham was way past where he wanted it to happen. It says at the set time of which God had spoken to him that he would deliver the promise, God did it. Somewhat anticlimactic. He had a baby. 25 years of praying, 25 years of trial, he had the baby. Sarah did it. The stress here is put on God's faithfulness to his promise rather than on outcome. Verse 3, and Abraham called the name of his son which was born to him, whom Sarah had born to him, because you remember he had another one that was not from Sarah, that was ironically, I forgot to close on that irony, they went to Egypt and put Sarah in a harem, and he had a son by the Egyptian woman. That's ironic. That's irony. Was that God's will? Neither of those things was God's will. He put his wife in the hands of the Egyptian, then he took an Egyptian and had a son by her. He said, that's not my plan. It was Sarah to bore him a son, and they named him Yitzchak, laughter. They named the son Laughter. Now, if you think that was an accident, buckle your seatbelt. I will point out to you, that word comes back around, believe it or not, in this chapter. Now, going back to 18, that next verse, when the three men were there, she was in the door of the tent. Now, Abraham and Sarah were old, well advanced in age. Sarah had passed the age of childbearing, and even when she was before still in the age of childbearing, she was barren back then. She couldn't conceive. So she had a double whammy. Therefore, Sarah laughed. She yitzchaked. Within herself, she did it quietly, but she laughed, saying, after I am worn out, is what it says in Hebrew, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? So I'm not the whole problem. Old Abraham has got some issues too. Verse 4. Then Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old. This is going to become later. Remember, we always are going in every which direction, but this is reaching forward. This is forecasting what is going to be in the law of Moses. And as if John Hilker was here, he would be raising his hand right now to tell us that there is a thing with the blood, so that before 8 days old they would keep bleeding, that God had prescribed something and there's medical fact behind it. What do you know? God knows what he's doing. As God had commanded him. What? That same phrase again. He obeyed God. God knew what he was doing. Now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Again, that's rather anticlimactic. And Sarah said, God has made me laugh with joy, has made me Yitzchak. And all who hear about the birth of my son, Yitzchak, will Yitzchak with me. So is the author wanting to remind us, not only did Sarah laugh, but you remember back in chapter 17, Abraham laying on his face in chapter 17, and he laughed when God said, you're going to have a son. Verse 7 says, she also said, who would have said, and that word there is only used 4 or 5 times in the whole Old Testament, that said. And it's more like it's a very strong word. She also said, who would have declared or exclaimed, who would have shouted out to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? For I have borne him a son in his old age. And that's not the end of the connection. In the next verse, as the narrative here turns, so that was the announcement of the birth of Isaac, Yitzchak. And here the story turns back, well, what about Hagar and your 13-year-old son? Your half Egyptian 13-year-old son. So the child, Isaac, grew and was weaned. Abraham made a great feast on the same day that Isaac was weaned. Verse 9, and Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, scoffing. And this word here is yitzchaking, and it's a very strong, it's a participle, and it's done in a tense that makes it very strong. Laughing really hard, just really guffawing, presumably about Isaac, making fun of Isaac. He was presenting a threat in her eyes. And again, as we say every week, this is storytelling, and so often in storytelling, we're not told what's inside people's mind. We're kind of watching the action unfold, and we have to make determinations about ourselves, and we have to determine how big a threat Ishmael is. But there seems to be some validation of this as we go through it, because we see here in the next couple of verses, Abraham's not keen on the idea. Abraham's pretty fond of Ishmael. Therefore, Sarah said to Abraham, drive out this bondwoman, this slave girl is probably a better translation there. Drive out this slave girl and her son, for the son of this slave girl, and it's said twice, shall not be heir with my son Isaac. That word cast out there, translated cast out, that's the word when God commands them to go into the land later. The wandering Israelites come to the banks of the Jordan and go in, and God tells them there's a numerous people in the land. Drive them out. And he says, and I will drive them out. I will drive them before you. So there's a force to this word. This is get her out of here now, and get her out of here in a way that leaves no question if she can come back or not. Verse 11, and the matter was very displeasing in Abraham's sight because of his son. He did not want to do it. He was fond of Ishmael. It was his son. So is Sarah right or is Sarah wrong? Is she being petty? Hagar had tried to run away before because she had mocked. Now, in chapter 16, and the author again has told these stories in a way that we are to make connections back with chapter 16. Hagar had begun mocking Sarah at that time and had gotten rather haughty, and then Sarah was striking back at her, and Hagar got upset and ran away. So what do you think? Is Sarah right or wrong?
This is what God wanted her to do.
Well, you've read ahead. I was trying to get you to make a value judgment. In the end, yes. And I find it interesting. I couldn't help as I was, well, let's look at the scripture and then I'll give my thoughts. But God said to Abraham, do not let it be displeasing in your sight. Don't get upset about this because of the lad going away, or because of your slave girl. So I think he had some affection for Hagar too. And so let's just stop right there. We can't jump back to ancient times. We don't, at least as far as I know, none of us practice polygamy. It would be bad being living in the same house, it seems to me, with your husband's mistress and her child. I think that's fraught with difficulty. I think is displeasing to Jesus. And so I think it is a good idea for her not to be there. What do you think, Faye?
Hagar was a bondswoman. She had no say-so over anything.
She was. It was a different system, and we could have a long discussion about that. It's hard for modern people to understand that circumstance. But just to have a young lady there that your husband has fathered a child by has difficulties. There's difficulties there. God is clarifying, and this is one of the benefits. We are given a God's eye view here. We're given God's opinion on things. Whatever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice. For in Isaac your seed shall be called. In other words, there's a seed that is coming. You remember the seed is the one, he's going to crush the head of the serpent, and the serpent is going to strike back at him. He's going to receive some damage as he vanquishes the serpent, as he deals with it. And Isaac is the guy. And what this story makes me think of is Rebekah and Isaac. When it says heed her voice, because in that story too, Isaac is old and he's blind, and Rebekah sends Jacob in, who God has told her previously, I'm going to pass the line of descendancy, the seed, and that's what we're tracking. That right there, in Isaac your seed shall be called. I believe that verse is taking us back to the theme of the book of Genesis. That is what the book of Genesis is about. I mean, the whole Bible is about God, but his plan is he's going to send somebody eventually, the seed, to deal with the sin problem. He's going to crush the head of the serpent. And mankind, in this case Abraham, keeps making plans that jeopardize, as Faye was saying earlier, jeopardize the seed. He put Sarah into the Egyptian harem. He put her in Abimelech's harem. We saw that last week. He went and slept with the handmaid, the Egyptian handmaid, had a son by her. God is working a plan. Does he give up on Abraham when Abraham does not behave in a way that brings about his plan immediately? No. Does God give up on you when you behave in a way that takes you away from God's plan for your life rather than towards it? No. Thank you, Lord. Hallelujah. That's my testimony. And I'm so glad y'all can't look into my life in great depth and into my heart and know the bad things that I have done, because there'd be so many, it would distract you. You'd find it hard to listen to me. And I say that not confessing any great sin. I'm average in everything. I'm an average sinner. I'm like the rest of us. Faye, you've probably done way worse things than me. I'd say that, and of course I say that kidding, way worse to you and me, but God's seen it all. Jesus went to the cross eyes open. God saw that it was good, and then later he saw that it wasn't good. He saw that there was every intent of their heart was wicked all the time, is what it says. But God does not give up on us. But does God give up on his plan when we hijack it? No. God is working a plan. Well, what about, do you think COVID-19 has surprised God? No. Do you think he said, well, let me put my plan on hold till we can figure out if we can do something with get rid of this COVID? No. Have we all responded to COVID in a way that is pleasing to Jesus? No. Some good, some bad. It's like everything else in our life. God continues to work, even when we're not working with him. But our job is to try to work with him as much as we can. And so he said, listen to Sarah's voice. She is doing my plan. My plan is Isaac. Same thing with Rebekah. Rebekah, wrapped Jacob's arm in a lamb, made stew, all that to work a plan. And as I've told you, I think that in that case, a lot of people have always preached that Rebekah is bad. No, Rebekah knows God's plan and she's working it out. Listen to Sarah's voice, for it's Isaac. In Isaac your seed shall be called. Verse 13. Yet don't worry about Ishmael. And this is a concession. It's very interesting. Yet I also will make a nation of the son of your slave woman, because he is your seed, and you are the father of all who have faith. I'm going to make a great nation out of Ishmael. Now, this is what I would say. We could go on into the prophets, and there is prophecy that Ishmael and Isaac will fight throughout history. And so what you have are two sons of Abraham, Isaac and Ishmael, and great nations will descend from them. Is that true? Yes. And is it true that they have had conflict throughout history? Yes. Do they have conflict now? Yes. You go to the end of the book. We studied Revelation before Genesis, and it said it's Isaac and Ishmael's descendants that will be fighting at the end of time. But God is working a plan. So I think this is pretty huge stuff here. I think this is pretty hard to refute, and you can divide the Bible up into lots of little puzzle pieces, and you can pull them out of the box and criticize them, individual pieces. I think you're wrong to do that, but you can do what you want to. Anybody can do what they want to. But I think it's hard if you step back and hear what the text is saying, two sons of one man, and they're going to be a thread. Their conflict is going to be a thread through human history, and the world will end. The world as we know it will end as this conflict comes to a head. I think that's pretty hard to refute that that is a truth. And that is a timeless truth. And I don't think you need to be mystical or spiritual to see that truth. I think you have to be really hard-hearted to not see that truth. Verse 14, so Abraham rose early in the morning. You remember, early in the morning, you are pleasing God. Late in the evening, you're getting ready to sin. So I believe that phrase, he rose early in the morning, is an indication by the author that Abraham is doing God's will here. And he took bread and a skin of water, putting them on her shoulder, he gave it, the water, and the boy to Hagar and sent her away. Then she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba, the desert of the well of the oath. Beersheba, Beer, B-E-E-R, Beer, that is well in Hebrew. Sheba is the number 7 in Hebrew, and it means an oath. So it is the well of the oath. Where is that? Well, that's not far from where, that's just south of where they are, Beersheba. And the water in the skin was used up, and she placed the boy under one of the shrubs. Then she went and sat down across from him at a distance of about a bow shot. For she said to herself, let me not see the death of the boy. So she sat opposite him and lifted her voice and wept. Now, this is the course that she had taken back in 16 when she ran before. So she was running back home to Egypt. She lost her way and she sat down to die. Have you ever seen anybody sit down and give up? I've told you the story before. When I went into the Grand Canyon, my buddy got so tired, and he and I, for several hours by that point, we'd walked in the Grand Canyon, we were coming out, we walked up the Devil's Corkscrew, it was 125 degrees, and it cooked us. And we got up to the, Bright Angel Trail, which is just a zigzag up the side of the cliff out for the last mile. You're just zigzagging up a cliff. And he had sat down many times, and I had, I'd say we got to keep going, because it was, when he sat down this last time, it was about 8:30, 8:45, and it was the sun was starting to go down, and that trail is only about three feet wide. You don't need to be walking up the trail after dark. And so I was up at the front, and I'd yell, get up. And most time I'd say, drink some water, let's go, we got to keep going. And this time he sat down, I said, get up. And he had this, it was an angry look, and he just looked away from me. And that's the only time I've ever seen that. He was so tired that he wouldn't listen to me. And we got out, but I'll never forget the look in his eye. Despair, exhaustion. They say at the Horns of Hattin, which is in the Crusades, it's the greatest massacre in the Crusades. They tricked the Crusaders, the Saracen tricked the Crusaders and surrounded them, and they did it in a way where they trapped them away from the water. And this is in the desert, and they were wearing, the armor, the metal armor out in the middle of the desert. and the Crusaders charged and charged and charged and couldn't break the line. They had no water. And they finally laid down. They were so tired that they laid down. And the Saracen went, and it said, kill them by pushing a knife in their face mask. And said they just laid there and took it. They were so tired that they couldn't do it. So we see something like that. That's pretty gruesome pictures. We see something like this, just total despair. She sits down and she wept in despair, giving up hope. I think this is one of my, I say, favorite images, most stirring images in the Bible to me, because I believe this is the condition of most people, all lost people, but it's spiritual water that they're thirsting for. It is significance and meaning. And I think sooner or later, all people come to this point of spiritual despair. Why am I alive? What is my life about? Why do I exist? What's the point of all this craziness? And we can slip into this point too. Let me not say that Christian people are immune to that. But what is the Bible about? The Bible is about God, and how does God respond to that kind of despair? And God heard the voice of the lad. Then the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said to her, "What ails you, Hagar?" And again, there's that essential question. Does God know what's wrong with Hagar? Of course he does. Why does he ask the question? Why did he ask Adam way back in chapter 3, where are you? The question is for Hagar, isn't it? Why are you scared? Why are you so upset, Hagar? Why are you despairing? Now, how far away is water? She is despairing of thirst. How far away is water? We'll see here in a minute. It's really close. Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him with your hand, for I will make him a great nation. I have a purpose here. Let's see. And to make the comparison back to chapter 16, when she ran, very near this same place, the angel of the Lord said to her, "Behold, you are with child, and you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. And he shall be a wild donkey of a man. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him. He shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren." So, one thing that's going on here is that Hagar has been told that she's going to be fine, and she has forgotten God's promise to her. And she's like, life has not worked out the way I wanted to. I wanted for this to happen. I mean, I'm reading into it, but I wanted this to happen to Sarah, and for Sarah to be banished, and for me to be the first wife, and Abraham to be my vehicle of success. I wanted to be the favored wife, and so my life has not turned out the way I wanted to. Has God delivered to Hagar everything he promised? He has, but what he didn't deliver was her expectations, what she wanted to happen. Then God opened her eyes. You remember that being a godly quality? And God saw that it was good. God had perspective. God was looking at his purposes. We see she was trying to see what she wanted to see, and she wasn't getting her way, and she sat down. She was sitting right by the water. She had sat down to despair, and all the while salvation was right beside her. Is that not, I mean, I have no doubt that this really happened, but is that not metaphorical? for our lostness. Our life has not worked out the way we wanted. God, why'd you create me? If you're even up there, why'd you create me? What's the purpose? The well is next to you. Salvation is available to you. And she went and she filled the skin with water and gave the lad a drink. So God was with the lad, and he grew and he dwelt in the wilderness, and he became an archer. Ironically, she had set him down a bow shot away. He became an archer. Verse 21, he dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Again, a connection with Egypt. So that's the story there. To me, that's a wonderful story. And she is the proverbial lost person who sits down in despair. And salvation is available to her. It's near to her. But it takes an act of God. I believe that's doctrine right there. God has to open our eyes to see that salvation is real and it's for us. Genesis 21:22, we take a turn to draw us back, and I think there's a big theme that comes through this story. The covenant with Abimelech. So if you remember from last chapter, he was in the land of the Philistines, which is part of the promised land, but it's kind of within their territory. And it came to pass at that time that Abimelech, my father was king, and Phicol, the commander of his army, spoke with Abraham, saying, God is with you in all that you do. All right? They are telling us something in the course of this story. They are telling us a big truth. God is with you in all that you do. Abraham is still living with the Philistines, where we left him in chapter 20. All this drama with Hagar having Isaac happened while they were dwelling in the land of the Philistines. Now therefore, Abimelech says, swear to me by God that you will not deal falsely with me, with my offspring or my posterity, but that according to the kindness that I have done to you, and Abimelech's been really cool about things, you will do to me and to the land in which you have dwelled. And Abraham said, I will swear. So God is with you. I'm asking you to deal honestly with me. Let's be straight up in our dealings. Abraham, so we're supposed to see in this, Abraham's still wandering. Even that God had made several promises to him, and now he has delivered a son, the son of promise, the son of calling, but it also made land promises. Those have not been delivered. Okay? Let's draw a connection. Did God promise to send his son for us? Yes. Has he delivered on that? Yes. Can you be saved now? Yes. Are you in the promised land? No. We still have an unfulfilled promise as part of our salvation. And you know what? When things get bad, we cling to that, don't we? When this world gets untenable for us, we cling to that future and unfulfilled promise. Remember, the term we've talked about salvation when we talk about the New Testament, that our salvation is already, but not yet. We are saved from the penalty of sin right now, but we're not yet delivered from the presence of sin. And so our salvation is not completed in one sense. There's a future land promise that is coming to us. So that's not dissimilar. And that's not, the author here is trying to make that point through this story with Abimelech. So we go on in verse 25. Then Abraham rebuked Abimelech because the well of water which Abimelech's servants had ceased. So there was a conflict. That's another sub-theme. One sub-theme that we see is Abraham keeps jeopardizing the promised seed, making bad choices. He offered the land of promise to Lot, and we saw that Lot is a little bit questionable in his judgment. Fortunately, he picked Sodom and Gomorrah and not the promised land. But another theme is that theme of conflict. Abraham keeps running into conflict. And in the end, how does he get through it? Well, God delivers him through the conflict. Then Abraham rebuked Abimelech because the well of water which Abimelech's servants had seized. And Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this thing. You did not tell me, nor had I heard about it until today. So this is the desert. They graze their flocks and water their flocks, and wells are everything. It's the whole ball of wax. And apparently, some of Abimelech's servants resented these foreigners being there and watering their flocks, and they took the well back from them. So Abraham, verse 27, took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech. And the two of them made a covenant, an agreement, and a treaty. And Abraham set 7 ewe lambs, female lambs, of the flock by themselves. Now that word 7, again, is Sheba, and that is oath. That word also means oath, and so I think there's some wordplay going on here. Then Abimelech asked Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs which you have set off by themselves? And Abraham said, you will take these 7 lambs from my hand, that they may be my witness that I have dug this well. Okay? So this is an oath. He's making an oath here in a manner of speaking. I think there's wordplay that these are 7 lambs of promise or oath. Therefore, he called that place Well of Oath. Well of 7. That's what that word means, Beersheba. The well of 7 or the well of oath. Because the two of them swore an oath there. So at Beersheba, they swore a Sheba. Isn't that something? Think this was all made up? This was inspired. Verse 32, thus they made a covenant at Beersheba. That phrase, that whole phrase is wordplay. They made a Bereshit at Beersheba. No, not a Bereshit. I'll have to look it up. Thus they made a covenant at Beersheba. So Abimelech rose with Phicol, the commander of his army, and they returned to the land of the Philistines. Then Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there he called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham stayed in the land of Philistines for many days. So let's sum this up. What does it say in Psalms 105 about Abraham? When they went from one nation to another, they were wandering. Abraham is still wandering at this time with an undelivered land promise. From one kingdom to another people, he permitted no one of them to do wrong. This is the other people. And he rebuked kings for their sake. So this psalm is reflecting back on this story in particular. In the book of Hebrews, it says about Abraham, in the hall of faith, in Hebrews chapter 11, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out of the place which he would receive as an inheritance. So this is probably up in Mesopotamia, in Haran, where he's with his father. So he left his land and his father's house to go where God had led him. So far, God has led him as a journeyman, as a sojourner. And I think that's very important. We all crave a home, a solid residence, and that's the contrast. Abraham is from Babylon. How did the early chapters, chapter 11, define the Babylonians? They were places that wanted a secure big house to stay in one place and to work at their lives. And God said, no, I want you to go where I take you. I want you to blow with the wind in this case. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country. That's what this is talking about here. So he is there in what will eventually become the nation of Israel. The Philistines are there now, so he's a wanderer. And Abraham all throughout his life is a wanderer in the land. That's what the land that was promised in chapter 12. dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise, for he waited for a city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. It's pretty nice phrase, isn't it? He was living temporarily because he wanted his foundation to be a spiritual city built by God. So take the things that make up my life, Lord, and build your kingdom. Rather than me building me a kingdom, and then I can give you part, or I can give you a tent, or I can let you, you know what, God, after I've built my kingdom, you can have a big event on the grounds. I think sometimes we say that, but it's saying Abraham did the reverse. He didn't have his own place, but he made his life about a spiritual foundation in God. And God building a building of faith in him, in his life. That's good stuff. That's poetic. Whose builder and maker is God. By faith, Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed. She bore a child when she was past age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. And there we see in Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews tying a loop back to he had done what he said he would do. She was able to have a child because of God's faithfulness. She was able to recognize God's faithfulness. So what lessons? God cares for our suffering. As we go through difficulties, Abraham had a difficulty. One of his wells had been stolen. God cares about those things. I say those small things. They're not small to us, but to God they're small things. Everything we've talked about and prayed about today to God is a small thing, and he does care, but it's not the most important things, our sufferings. As we tarry here on planet Earth, if we have asked Jesus into our heart, we are citizens of heaven, and we are strangers and aliens here. Jesus is preparing our true home in glory. As we tarry, as we wander, as we sojourn in this land where we are aliens, we are allowing Jesus to build a spiritual kingdom through us and in us and with us, rather than us building a life for ourselves and making him a part of it. Nevertheless, God works to help us, as he did Abraham, to get through this life. And so both are true. God is with us in this life and helps us along. He helped Abraham out of one difficulty after another. But in the end, he wants our faithfulness and our obedience so that he can build in us an eternal home. That's God. Any questions or comments as we close?